We're all one, we're all the same. We all came from Africa, we're all human. At least, that's what some people want you to believe. But the truth, not all of those statements are accurate. And you know what? That's a good thing. The reason some people automatically see our differences as a bad thing is because for years we've been conditioned to think that way. We've been bombarded with propaganda and indoctrination telling us that acknowledging our differences is somehow wrong. They'll call it racist, prejudiced, or even sexist, claiming it goes against equality. But honestly, I'm sick and tired of this childish narrative about who we are as people.
I may speak the English language better than I speak my Chinese language, but I'll never be an Englishman in 1,000 generations. And I have not got the Western value system inside. It's an Oriental Eastern value system. But I use Western concepts, Western words, because I understand it. But I also have a different system in my mind. But I say a person who gets deculturalized, and I nearly was, so I know this danger. He loses his self-confidence. You get a sense of deprivation. For optimum performance, a man must know himself, know the world.
It's time to grow up and face reality. Different ethnic groups are different. And that's not a bad thing. Each group has contributed both positives and negatives throughout history, and it's only by acknowledging this that we can truly move forward and truly find peace. Ethnic and cultural groups living separately for thousands of years. That's what's made history so fascinating and our story as people so intriguing. Just look at the breathtaking architecture of Rome, an empire that built wonders, yet they also conquered and crucified people. Take the Persians. They gave us incredible advancements in science, art, and governance, but they also waged brutal wars and ruled with an iron fist. The Japanese? A culture of unmatched discipline and innovation, from samurai traditions to cutting-edge technology, but they've had their fair share of imperialism and conflict. And even the Scots, fierce warriors who fought for their independence and gave the world incredible inventions like the steam train, yet they too experienced internal conflicts and hardships. And what about the tribes of the Amazon rainforest? Some might say, well, they haven't progressed or built grand structures like the Western world. But you know what? That's a good thing. They've mastered living in harmony with their environment, using plants for food and medicine in ways we can still learn from today. Honestly, sometimes I think I'd rather go back to the ancient English way of life, connected to nature, family, and community, rather than this modern corporate world that keeps us trapped indoors, disconnected from what truly matters. So why are we all so different? And when did this all start? Well, this goes back to why we aren't all from Africa and why we aren't all human. We've been fed a simple narrative. We all came from Africa, evolved into modern humans, and spread across the globe, replacing all other human-like species. It's been taught in schools, pushed in the media for their one-world agenda, and unfortunately accepted without question. But modern science tells us a very different story. The widely accepted out-of-Africa replacement model claimed that Homo sapiens emerged exclusively from Africa around 200,000 years ago, gradually replacing other hominin species such as Neanderthals and Homo erectus without interbreeding. However, recent discoveries and advances in genetic sequencing have completely debunked this outdated theory. As Professor Christopher Stringer, one of the leading proponents of the out-of-Africa model, now acknowledges, at the moment, I'm looking again at the whole question of a recent African origin for modern humans. The leading idea over the last 20 years has argued that we had a recent African origin, that we came out of Africa, and that we replaced all of the other human forms that were outside of Africa. But we're having to re-evaluate that now. We're having to re-evaluate the out-of-Africa theory. We're having to evaluate the species concepts we apply. 20 years ago, I would have argued that it was a simple, single recent event. Now, I don't think it was that simple within or outside of Africa, The latest evidence challenges the idea of a singular African origin, and instead points to a complex web of interbreeding and evolution across continents. The truth about our origins? Thanks to modern genetic research, we now know that Homo sapiens did not replace earlier populations, but interbred with them, contributing to the genetic diversity we see today. Neanderthal DNA, found in non-African populations, with Europeans and Asians carrying about 2% of their genome from Neanderthals. These genes have influenced traits such as skin pigmentation, immune system function, and even cognitive traits. Denisovan DNA, found in populations from Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of East Asia, with some groups carrying up to 6% Denisovan DNA. These contributions have helped populations adapt to challenging environments such as high altitudes. Ghost species. DNA. Sub-Saharan Africans contain up to 20% DNA from an unknown super-archaic hominin species, likely Homo erectus, or another early hominin, which is completely absent in non-African populations. These findings prove that modern humans are not the result of a single exodus from Africa, but rather a product of multiple waves of migration and hybridization over hundreds of thousands of years. Professor Stringer himself once supported the Out of Africa model wholeheartedly, but he later admitted that evidence from sites like Jebel Yahud in Morocco, where fossils once thought to be 40,000 years old were redated to 300,000 years ago, forced him to reconsider. He stated, "It was strong evidence that supported the idea that modern humans have a recent African origin. However, this recent African origin claim began to crumble with newer discoveries and dating techniques. Fossil evidence from Israel, for example, showed that Homo sapiens remains were found before Neanderthals in the region, contradicting the idea that modern humans directly descended from them. Meanwhile, advocates of the multi-regional model, such as Milford Woolpoff and Alan Thorne, argued that modern humans gradually evolved in different regions from Homo erectus over nearly 2 million years, maintaining local traits across generations. While this model had flaws, it raised valid points about regional adaptations and continuity in features found across populations today. In reality, the truth lies somewhere in between. Humans did migrate out of Africa, but they mixed with and absorbed other populations along the way, rather than simply replacing them. If interbreeding between Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans happened repeatedly over thousands of years, then the question arises, are we really all one species? Professor Stringer has argued that while interbreeding occurred, distinct anatomical and genetic features suggest that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens followed separate evolutionary paths for over 400,000 years, and this challenges the traditional notion of what it means to be human. Are we Homo sapiens, or are we hybrids of multiple human-like species? As geneticist Professor David Reich said, people are the result of layers and layers of mixture. There is no pure population. We are a trellis, not a tree. In other words, human evolution was not a linear path, but a complex network of hybridization, adaptation, and survival. Why this matters? The "we are all the same" narrative isn't just scientifically inaccurate, it's misleading and politically motivated. The reality is, different populations evolved under different conditions, faced unique challenges, and inherited distinct genetic traits. And that's not a bad thing. It's what makes humanity fascinating. Acknowledging our differences doesn't mean division. It means recognizing the incredible diversity that hybridization has given us. Genetics and culture. You hear this argument all the time. Some say it's all about genetics, while others insist it's culture that creates who we are. But the reality is, they're inseparable. Genes matter because they lay the foundation for who we are as individuals, creating everything from our physical traits to our behavioral tendencies. And those traits in turn influence the cultures we build and participate in. While culture plays an important part in shaping our lives, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Our genetic makeup affects not just how we look, our skin color, height, or physical abilities, but also how we think, behave, and even how society perceives us. And that perception, it's what fuels the cultural narratives and social structures we live within. Simply put, who we are genetically shapes the culture we create. One important element is how genetic diversity impacts health and adaptation. Populations that mix genetically often have greater resilience to certain illnesses because of increased genetic variation. This doesn't just affect individuals, it can shape cultural practices around things like health, food, and even intermarriage. There's also something called gene-culture coevolution, where genetic changes and cultural practices evolve together. A great example of this is how populations that practice dairy farming evolved the ability to digest lactose into adulthood. For instance, in Northern Europe, countries like Denmark, Sweden, and the UK, the genetic mutation developed around 5,000 years ago. This allowed populations to digest milk well into adulthood, as dairy farming became a major part of their diet and economy. Similarly, in East Africa, among pastoralist groups like the Maasai and Somali, a different mutation evolved independently, enabling them to rely on milk for sustenance in arid environments. On the other hand, populations with little history of dairy farming, such as East Asians, Indigenous Americans, and most Sub-Saharan Africans, typically did not develop lactase persistence, resulting in widespread lactose intolerance today. This fascinating relationship between culture and genetics demonstrates how the environments and lifestyles of our ancestors have shaped not just our dietary habits, but our very biology over generations. Because genetics also influences cognitive and behavioral traits, things like personality, intelligence, and temperament, that certain aspects of who we are, such as whether we're naturally risk-takers or more reserved, have a genetic basis. These traits form how we engage with others, which helps define the culture we're part of. Even cultural elements, like whether a community values cooperation or competition, can be indirectly influenced by the genetic makeup of the people within it. Now imagine bringing together two genetically distinct groups, each with vastly different tendencies toward cooperation and competition. History has shown us time and time again that it's rarely a peaceful or harmonious outcome. One culture dominates while the other fades into oblivion. Does this remind you of anywhere today? This pattern repeats throughout history. When two vastly different peoples are forced together, whether through conquest, colonization, or mass migration, it leads to conflict, displacement, and cultural erasure. Take, for example, the arrival of the Bell-Beaker people in Britain. Within just a few generations, nearly 90% of the genetic legacy of the indigenous Neolithic male population was wiped out. The newcomers didn't just bring new tools and customs, they completely transformed the genetic and cultural landscape, forever changing Britain in their image and erasing much of the original heritage. Or consider what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas. The vast and diverse Native American tribes, each with their own complex societies, spiritual beliefs, and ways of living, were rapidly displaced and destroyed both culturally and genetically. Their disappearance was the loss of people and the erasure of centuries of accumulated wisdom, knowledge, and an understanding of nature. Entire ways of life were extinguished in the blink of an eye. This is a warning. While progress and adaptation are natural parts of human history, we must recognize that not all cultural assimilation is beneficial. Each culture brings unique value that should be preserved, not overwritten. The loss of a culture is akin to the extinction of a species. So when we talk about diversity and integration today, we have to ask, why is this happening? Why are governments across Europe, Britain, and Ireland relentlessly pushing for multiculturalism despite everything history has taught us? What is the real purpose behind these policies, and who truly benefits? Because one thing is certain, it's not the native people of these lands. And if you're one of those people saying, well, Britain bombed their countries, so that's why they're coming here as refugees, let me stop you right there. That's complete nonsense. The people of Britain never wanted these wars. When the Iraq War kicked off, millions of us took to the streets in one of the biggest protests this country has ever seen. We marched, we shouted, we said no. But did the government listen? No. And it wasn't just Iraq. People protested every single war in the Middle East that followed, but our so-called leaders went ahead anyway, dragging us into conflicts we never signed up for. And now, after ignoring us for decades, they have the audacity to turn around and bring in thousands of refugees, without ever asking the people of this country if we wanted it. We were never given a choice, never given a voice, and yet it's us, ordinary people, who have to deal with the consequences. Our towns and cities change overnight, our resources get stretched thin, and if we dare to speak up, we're told we're the problem. Let's be clear, this isn't on us. It's on the politicians, the elites, and the warmongers who profit from destruction and then dump the fallout on everyday people. We said no to the wars, and we weren't given a say on the aftermath. And now, we're the ones paying the price. Every society has a foundation, its identity, culture, and heritage that defines its existence. When that foundation is eroded, the entire structure weakens. Throughout history, we have seen what happens when fundamentally different peoples are forced together. One culture inevitably replaces the other. Yet, despite this undeniable truth, we see leaders pushing policies that undermine the very core of their own nations. Why? I just watched Pale Rider, 1985, on the plane home from holiday, and there's a line that really hit me. It resonates so much with what's happening today. In the film, the antagonist, Coy LaHood, realizes the power that faith and purpose can give people when he says, "A man without spirit is whipped, but a preacher, he could give them faith. 1 ounce of faith, they'll be dug in deeper than a tick on a hound." And that's exactly the point. The reality is that the driving force behind mass migration isn't about the well-being of the people. It's about power, control, and economic gain. Fragmentation creates dependency. When you strip a population of its cultural identity, you take away its spirit, its sense of belonging and purpose. A divided people are easier to govern, easier to manipulate, and easier to exploit. Just like in Pale Rider, when people have faith, whether in themselves, their culture, or their future, they become unstoppable. But take that faith away, and they're left vulnerable, existing without purpose, without unity, and ultimately without resistance. The native people of these lands, the English, the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, are being asked to sacrifice their cultural inheritance, their connection to their ancestors, and their sense of belonging for an ideal that serves no higher purpose other than the enrichment of a select few. A culture that has taken thousands of years to cultivate cannot simply be reshaped overnight without consequence. And so we must ask, if the people are not asking for this, who is? Who gains from the dilution of national identity, the loss of cultural heritage, and the breakdown of our society? Certainly not the ordinary citizens who watch their communities change beyond recognition, who feel increasingly disconnected from their own homelands, and who are told that resistance to these changes is somehow wrong. The answer is clear. Those in power see diversity not as strength but as a tool. A tool to break apart strong, unified cultures and replace them with something weaker, more malleable, something easier to control. And yet history tells us that such experiments do not end well. The outcome is not coexistence, but displacement. Not harmony, but division. Not enrichment, but loss. A people without identity, a people without a future. If we do not ask these questions now, if we do not challenge the forces at play, then we risk repeating the patterns that history has shown us time and time again. And when the dust settles, who will remain to tell the story of those who were here before?